Hello, my name is Kirk McKenzie. I'm concerned about the direction that our country and our world are going in. And after more than 20 years and recent events, I am more concerned than ever. Accordingly, I have decided to be silent no more, and through a sequence of YouTube videos to share the information I have learned. I hope you find these to be informative and helpful. Thank you.
Today's presentation is a continuation of the series, Why We Are in So Much Debt, based upon the book, Money, Defending Your Prosperity. In part one, we talked about monetary concepts and the explanation of why our prosperity is constantly being challenged. In this presentation, we're going to talk about how the monetary system was assembled in the United States, piece by piece and brick by brick. Our story begins in 1773. That year, two forces were born. The Boston Tea Party was a symbol of the progressive struggle for man's individual liberty and freedom from tyranny. Yet, that same year, Amschel Rothschild, the German court factor for William of Hesse, calls together 12 other court factors and lays down the principle, "Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who makes the laws." He argued that if they worked together, they could use central banking as a means to take control of the world. In 1776, the duality continued. On July 4th, the United States declared its independence. But 2 months prior, on May 1st, the secret society called the Illuminati was formed by Professor Adam Weishaupt of Ingolstadt University. It was funded by the Rothschilds. Each of the members was given a secret name so that they could not reveal the identities of the others. His name was Spartacus. We therefore see the two arms of the strategy for world control, central banking and revolution. In 1783, the Illuminati took control of Freemasonry. We see on the Great Seal of the United States, which was created about that period of time, originally for coin, was prohibited from appearing on the national currency because of its Freemason design. It was put onto the U.S. $1 Federal Reserve note for the first time in 1933 by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. On the seal we see the words, Annui Cuptus, with Roman numerals, Novus Ordo Seclorum. Translated, 1776, year of the birth of the secular New World Order. Many have questioned the design and the all-seeing eye at the top of the capstone and the rays of illumination coming out of it. And whatever else it is certainly not a Christian symbol. It's interesting that we find this symbology repeated. Here we have the Empire State Building. In fact, it's interesting to note that we even have a state called the Empire State. In the lobby, we see the Empire State Building, which resembles an obelisk, and at the very top of it, a small pyramid with lights of illumination coming out of it. We see the same symbology represented and repeated the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the top of the Chrysler Building, the Fidelity Investments logo, and the Statue of Liberty. We also see this at the top of the Washington Monument, the Transamerica Building in San Francisco, and the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas. And we see it in other places around the world. Here we see it at the Louvre Museum with the rays of light or illumination or design of the landscape, and the pyramid, all recent modifications. And finally, we see here a poster with Stalin, the blood-red background of revolution with the rays of illumination in front. In 1781, we had the first attempt to form a central bank in the United States. The bank had been formed in 1780 by Robert Morris as the Bank of Pennsylvania, supported by Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was successful in getting Congress to approve a central bank on December 31st of 1781, and within 30 days, Robert Morris had transformed his Bank of Pennsylvania into the Bank of North America. It was complete with private investors, including foreign investors. In 1785, Pennsylvania repealed its charter because of the corruption and the fraud. Nonetheless, the bankers were 2 years later able to recover the remaining balance of the 20-year charter In 1798, Robert Morris was imprisoned, and in 1802, the charter expired. The 1787 U.S. Constitution is very clear. Article 1, Section 8 reads, "The Congress shall have the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. It does not have the power to print money, and furthermore, words that appeared in the original draft were omitted. Those words were, and emit bills on the credit of the United States, in other words, paper money." We can see in the James Madison notes for Thursday, August 16, 1787, the following dialogue regarding those words that were eventually deleted. Mr. Wilson, it will have a most salutary influence on the credit of the United States to remove the possibility of paper. This expedient can never succeed whilst its mischiefs are remembered, and as long as it can be restored to, it will be a bar to other resources. Mr. Reed thought the words, if not struck out, would be as alarming as the mark of the beast in Revelations. And Mr. Langdon had rather reject the whole plan, in other words, the entire Constitution, than retain the three words, and emit bills. Article 1, Section 10 confirms the philosophy. No state shall emit bills of credit, no paper money, or make anything but gold and silver coin in tender and payment of debts. The only constitutional currency is gold and silver coin. This has never been amended. This was no accident, but a deliberative policy. Here we have the words of the first President of the United States. Quote, "Paper money has had the effect in your state that it will ever have, to ruin commerce, oppress the honest, and open the door to every species of fraud and injustice. We may become a great commercial and flourishing nation, but if in the pursuit of the means we should unfortunately stumble again on unfounded paper money or any similar species of fraud, we shall assuredly give a fatal stab to our national credit in its infancy." He equates paper money to a fraud. The second President of the United States, John Adams. "Banks have done more injury to the religion, morality, tranquility, prosperity, and even wealth of the nation than they can have done or ever will do good." And then here's one of my favorite quotes. "All the perplexities, confusion, and distress in America arise not from defects in their Constitution or Confederation, nor from want of honor or virtue, so much as downright ignorance of the nature of coin, credit, and circulation." That is the purpose of these videos. And finally, the third President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. "I sincerely believe," he said, "that banking institutions are more dangerous than standing armies, and that the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity is but swindling futurity on a large scale. If we American people ever allow monopoly banking to control the issue of currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, these banks and bureaucracies that will grow up around them will deprive we, the people, of all our property until our children will wake up homeless on the continent which God gave us for our stewardship. We must not let our rulers load us down with perpetual debt. We must make our election between economy and liberty or profusion and servitude. If we run into such debt as that we must be taxed in our meat and in our drink, in our necessaries and our comforts, in our labors and our amusements, we will have no time to think, no means of calling our mismanagers to account, but be glad to obtain assistance by hiring ourselves to rivet their chains on the necks of our fellow sufferers. And this is the tendency of all human governments." Alexander Hamilton was born on the island of Nevis in the Caribbean. He became George Washington's aide-de-camp. He was a monarchist and a Rothschild agent. He, more than anyone else, was responsible for the overthrow of the Confederation in favor of a new constitution and a strong central government. He was working behind the scenes to bring about the Philadelphia Convention we now know as the Constitutional Convention in 1787. When it became known that the convention would in fact issue a constitution, but before it was signed, he left to write secretly and pen 2/3 of the Federalist Papers, papers that argue for a strong central government. These same papers being updated are being used today to justify a world government. In 1789, he became the first Treasury Secretary and promptly made the recommendation to form a national bank. In 1790 and 1791, he put the federal government immediately into debt and made a number of his fellow supporters quite rich in the process, so that when the Bank Act of 1791 came around, he was successful in securing congressional approval for a central bank. February 15th, 1791, before the vote was taken, Thomas Jefferson spoke out. "I consider the foundation of the Constitution is laid on this ground, that all powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to it by the states, are preserved to the states or to the people. To take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power, no longer susceptible of any definition. The incorporation of a bank and the powers assumed by this bill have not been delegated to the United States by the Constitution." He argued the central bank was unconstitutional. Nonetheless, on February 25th, he was overruled and Congress gave a 20-year charter for the first Bank of the United States. At this point in our history, the idea of a corporation was somewhat strange, and the argument for the few that were created was that they would be for the public good and they were for a specific purpose, hence a limited charter. The charter was set to expire in 1811. The president was James Madison. The northern merchants supported a renewal, but the South held it suspect and accused it of corruption and vote buying. On January 24th, it failed in the House by 1 vote, and on February 20th, it failed in the Senate in a tiebreaker by the vote of Vice President George Clinton, no relation to Bill. What follows is the War of 1812, and for what purpose? We had already won the Revolutionary War. If the purpose was to put our young national government in debt, it succeeded. The debt soared and approximately tripled in a 4 or 5 year period of time. Was this indeed a plan to force our government back to central banking? In the middle of this war, Nathan Rothschild takes over the Bank of England. The Battle of Waterloo was fought on June 18th, 1815, and Rothschild is one of the few to know that England prevailed. The next day, on the London Stock Exchange, he creates a panic by leaving the suggestion that, in fact, England had lost, that France had won. Prices plummeted, and before the end of the day, he had secretly purchased back things for a very low valuation. He was selective in his purchases. He specifically purchased the consols. Now, consols is a very unusual animal. It is a debt that can be never repaid. They were the monetary base for the Bank of England, and by acquiring its monetary base, he gained control of the Bank of England. He was like his father. "I care not what puppet is placed on the throne of England to rule the empire. The man that controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the money supply." What immediately begins at this point is Britain's imperial century in 1815, which is collapsed by 1914 in debt. It is interesting to note that the Federal Reserve, which was created in 1913, we can see what happens with the American experience and where we stand in debt approximately 100 years later. In 1816, if the war's purpose was in fact to get the Bank of the United States renewed or reestablished, it succeeded. The charter for what now has become known as the Second Bank of the United States was approved for 20 years. In 1822, its president becomes Nicholas Biddle. He's a Rothschild agent. In 1832, he sought renewal for the charter 4 years early, having learned from the prior failure of the renewal of the First Bank of the United States. He meets up with the strong will of Andrew Jackson, the president, who had investigated the bank and found corruption and vetoed renewal on November 24th of 1832. Nicholas Biddle declared a war on the United States, a struggle between who would rule this country, the people and its representative government, or the bankers. He did this by bringing about economic despair and stress, with the intent of putting all the pressure on the president to reform the system, in other words, to readopt a central bank. This is referred to as the Bank War of 1832 to 1836. During this period, we also had the first assassination attempt on a sitting U.S. president on January 30th, 1835. Nonetheless, Jackson prevails, he wins, and the charter expires in April of 1836. For the only 2 years in our nation's entire history, from 1835 to 1836, the national government was debt-free. Andrew Jackson was not a man to mince words, and it is worth listening to what he had to say. Quote, "I am one of those who do not believe that a national debt is a national blessing, but rather a curse to a republic, inasmuch as it is calculated to raise around the administration a moneyed aristocracy dangerous to the liberties of the country. The bold effort the present bank had made to control the government are but premonitions of the fate that waits the American people should they be deluded into a perpetuation of this institution or the establishment of another like it. Gentlemen," he says to the bankers, "I have had men watching you for a long time, and I am convinced that you have used the funds of the bank to speculate in the breadstuffs of the country. When you won, you divided the profits amongst you, and when you lost, you charged it to the bank. You tell me that if I take the deposits from the bank and annul its charter, I shall ruin 10,000 families. That may be true, gentlemen, but that is your sin. Should I let you go on, you will ruin 50,000 families, and that would be my sin. You are a den of vipers and thieves. I intend to rout you out, and by the grace of the eternal God will rout you out. If Congress has the right under the Constitution to issue paper money, it was given to be used by themselves, not to be delegated to individuals or corporations. Nonetheless, the bank, the money power, continues to proceed on its agenda. In 1841, on August 16th, President John Tyler vetoes the Senate bill to establish a central bank. Quote, "The power of Congress to create a national bank has been a question of dispute from the origin of the government. My own opinion has been uniformly proclaimed to be against the exercise of any such power by this government. By this vote, he is excommunicated from his own party, the Republican Party, and becomes one of the first, if not the only, presidents to become independent while in office." On February 21st, 1848, Karl Marx issues his famous Communist Manifesto, containing a 10-point plan for world control. Point 5 picks up on the Rothschild scheme, centralization of credit in a monopolistic central bank. Point 1, abolition of private property. In 1861, paper money reappears as a national currency for the first time since the nation's founding in 1791. In order to fund the Civil War, Lincoln cannot just make gold and silver. He either has to tax it or he has to borrow it. The Rothschilds and the banks in New York were quoting interest rates of 30 to 40%. Instead, Lincoln breached faith with the Constitution and started printing money. In 1861, they were called demand notes because you could demand gold or silver in exchange. These last for 9 months. The Treasury didn't have the gold or silver. That's why it was printing the paper money. what was then authorized as United States notes, also referred to as legal tender notes. They had some similarities. They were issued by government and they were redeemable, but they were not redeemable on demand. It was indefinite when you could get the gold or silver in exchange. And although you had to take this money, the government would not accept it back in payment of taxes. We can see that by taking a look at the demand note in 1861, where the words on demand appear, as well as the words receivable in payment of all public dues. The legal tender note shown here in 1862 is identical in all respects, except those words have been removed. For all their faults, legal tender notes have one powerful argument in favor of them. They allow the government to operate interest and debt-free. The government can print these, issue them in circulation without borrowing money. This prompted an immediate response from London. That same year, a circular goes out, now referred to as the Hazard Circular, and a related article appears in the London Times. Quote, "If that mischievous financial policy, which had its origin in the North American Republic, should become indurated down to a fixture, then that government will furnish its own money without cost. It will pay off its debts and be without a debt. It will become prosperous beyond precedent in the history of the civilized governments of the world. The brains and wealth of all countries will go to North America. That government must be destroyed, or it will destroy every monarchy on the globe." London and the Bank of England had declared war on legal tender notes. They succeeded. The next year, in 1863, when the South was no longer represented in Congress and there was a question whether a quorum was in fact even present, they authorized the National Bank Act. It authorized the federal government to directly charter private corporations, and not necessarily for the public good, but for private gain. By this mechanism, organizations were created that would completely bypass the states. And it authorized these banks to issue a debt-monetized currency called national bank notes. Federal Reserve notes are nothing more than national bank notes, the current version of that. It allowed the bankers to double their wealth, and it also allowed them to collude. The result was the age of robber barons. Trusts and monopolies were created, and the bankers who controlled the gold immediately went on the attack for silver. Recall that the Constitution made both gold and silver money. But silver was the friend of the people, and the bankers went on the attack to eliminate that. It didn't want the strategy of bimetallism. It wanted a single metal. This empowerment and enrichment of the bankers starts yet another fundamental transformation in the country. The national debt soars. Here is a chart of the national debt from 1791, when the federal government begins, until 1872. Alexander Hamilton put our country in debt, Andrew Jackson got it out, and Abraham Lincoln, to fight the Civil War, increased the national debt by 43 times in 4 years. This is comparable to Barack Obama coming in office, and by the end of his administration, our national debt would be $500 trillion. The paper that was issued promptly declines in value from $1 to 45 cents. In other words, the soldiers that were fighting this war were being paid for less than half. Abraham Lincoln was no fool. He understood that he was doing a deal with the devil. I see in the near future a crisis approaching. It unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. The money power preys upon the nation in times of peace and conspires against it in times of adversity. It is more despotic than a monarchy, more insolent than autocracy, more selfish than bureaucracy. It denounces as public enemies all who question its method or throw light upon its crimes. I have two great enemies, the Southern Army in front of me and the financial institutions at the rear. The latter is my greatest foe. Corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow. And the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudice of the people until the wealth is aggregated in the hands of a few and the republic is destroyed. He no doubt intended to put everything back into its original place. He gave that speech on November 11th, 1864, and was assassinated 5 months later. In 1868, these debts were locked in. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. We normally think of the 14th Amendment as one that gave citizenship to the former slave. The 13th, the one that eliminated slavery, and the 14th gave them citizenship. But we find something very unusual in this amendment. We find some clauses that have nothing to do with slavery. There's a clause, in fact, about money. Section 4 reads in part, "The validity of the public debt of the United States, authorized by law, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services in suppressing insurrection or rebellion, shall not be questioned." Let's read that again. The validity of the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned. In other words, we've had president after president saying that the power of a central bank leads to the corruption of the political process. But this amendment purportedly puts that beyond any judicial review. Is that, in fact, the status of our country today, that nobody can question the trillions of dollars of debt that are being put upon us, or how, or by whom, including loans that are being made to foreign countries and governments? It's interesting to take a look at the nature of the passage of the 14th Amendment. The Civil War ended on April 9th of 1865 when General Lee surrendered. A week later, Lincoln was assassinated. On April 2nd, 1866, by that point, Andrew Johnson, the new president, had declared the insurrection over. The southern states were restored and reseated in Congress. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution was approved by Congress on January 31st, 1865, prior to the end of the war, when the South was not seated, and clearly there was no quorum present. Nonetheless, the southern states participate in the ratification process, and seven southern states vote in favor. The amendment would not have been ratified without their votes. And on December 18th, 1865, Secretary of State William Seward declares the amendment ratified. The 14th Amendment is approved by Congress on June 13th of 1866 and is promptly sent to the states for ratification on June 16th. In a speech, however, a week later, President Andrew Johnson makes it publicly known that he had been not given a chance to review or sign the amendment. Congress had bypassed the President of the United States. 15 states rejected the 14th Amendment, beginning with Texas on October 17th of 1866. Texas was promptly followed by Georgia, Florida, Alabama, North Carolina, Arkansas, South Carolina, Kentucky, Virginia, Ohio, Mississippi, Louisiana, Delaware, Maryland, and New Jersey. It's interesting to note that of these, we include the 7 that actually voted in favor of the 13th Amendment ending slavery. What follows then is Congress passes a series of acts referred to as the Reconstruction Acts, beginning on March 2nd of 1867. The effect of these acts is to put 10 of the southern states and put them under military rule. That includes all 7 of the states that had ratified the 13th Amendment, plus 3 more. They were denied representation in Congress. The legislatures were removed with military force and replaced by rump legislatures, and they were forced under military threat to change their constitutions, elect suitable legislatures, and ratify the 14th Amendment. The Reconstruction Acts were vetoed by President Andrew Johnson, but passed over his veto. He argued they were unconstitutional, and we have the following words. Congress declares these local state governments to be illegal governments and then provides that these illegal governments shall be carried on by federal officers who are to perform the very duties of on its own officers by this illegal state authority. When 7 of which votes were given in favor of the 13th Amendment by 7 of these states, it was proclaimed to be a part of the Constitution, and slavery was declared no longer to exist. If these 7 states were not legal states of the Union, it follows as an inevitable consequence that in some of the states, slavery yet exists. He points out the contradiction in accepting those 7 states' vote in favor of the 13th, but denying them the vote when they vote against the 14th. Within a period of less than a year, the legislation of Congress has attempted to strip the executive department of the government of some of its essential powers. The military commander is, as to the power of appointment, made to take the place of its president, and the general arm of the army the place of the Senate. And any attempt on the part of the president to assert his own constitutional power may, under pretense of law, be met by official insubordination. In this situation, and under this environment, southern states ratified the 14th Amendment, and it becomes approved. One might then question what were the 14th Amendment and the Civil War truly about. Were they about ending slavery and citizenship for former slaves? Or were they in fact a strategy for dividing and conquering and creating slavery for all by the creation and perpetuation of debt, the creation of central banking, and the use of banknotes? Or in the words of Bernard Baruch, all wars are economic in nature. If they were for the purpose of creating slavery for all, we have in support the words of Leo Tolstoy. Money is a new form of slavery and distinguishable from the old simply by the fact that it is impersonal, that there is no human relationship between master and slave. In 1869, the matter goes to the Supreme Court, and paper money is declared unconstitutional. We are obliged to conclude that an act making mere promises to pay dollars, and when they use the word dollars, it's in its original sense, in other words, gold and silver coin. We are obliged to conclude that an act making mere promises to pay dollars is inconsistent with the spirit of the Constitution, and that it is prohibited by the Constitution. That same day, President Ulysses Grant, who was known for his cronyism to the point that the term was changed to Grantism, appointed 2 new Supreme Court justices. And the matter was reheard by the Supreme Court 2 years later by the newly reformed Supreme Court. And in a sequence of decisions called the legal tender cases, the Supreme Court now ruled that paper was okay after all. On March 4th, 1881, Garfield was inaugurated. The first charter period would expire during his term. He was opposed. Whoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce. By the experience of commercial nations in all ages, it has been found that gold and silver afford the only safe foundations for a monetary system. The chief duty of the national government in connection with the currency of the country is to coin money and declare its value. Grave doubts have been entertained whether Congress is authorized by the Constitution to make any form of paper money legal tender. He was assassinated on July 2nd, 1881, and upon his death on September 19th, Vice President Chester Arthur became the 21st President of the United States. And in 1882, on July 12th, he approved the National Bank Charter extension for an additional 20-year period. That's now referred to as the Second Charter Period. In 1882, a book was published by the name of Financial Catechism and History of the Financial Legislation of the United States from 1862 to 1882 by S.M. Price. It was, in fact, an expose of the financial legislation passed during the first charter period to alarm and alert the American public. In his introduction, He says, "It is no matter of wonder that this class who control the destinies of the people by controlling their finances are strongly opposed to the education of the people on the subject of finance, for they know that when this is effected, their dominion as financial rulers must cease." In 1899, another book is written called The Coming Battle, which has been resurrected. It refers to the presidential election of 1900. The candidates that year included the Democratic William Jennings Bryan, who was in favor of bimetallism and silver, arguing, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this cross of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." A more accurate statement would be that the money power is going after the elimination of silver in favor of substituting paper. William McKinley was the Republican candidate. He was against silver and for a single metal strategy. He was, in terms of those days, an anti-silverite. McKinley was elected, William Jennings Bryan and silver defeated. However, McKinley, although he was for the bankers when it came to the elimination of silver, was against the renewal of the National Bank. Our financial system needs some revision. Our money is all good now, but its value must not further be threatened. It should all be put upon an enduring basis, not subject to easy attack, nor its stability to doubt or dispute. He was assassinated September 6, 1901, while visiting Buffalo, New York. Vice President Teddy Roosevelt, of a New York banking family, became the 26th president and the first progressive in office. In April 1902, he approved the extension of the National Bank Act for an additional 20 years, now referred to as the Third Charter Period. During his administration, the planning to transform the nation once again began. This included the push for a permanent central bank, which was accomplished by the following. In 1907, J.P. Morgan intentionally created a panic on a particular bank, and then through the publication of news, went about and said about a general economic distress. This distress was used to justify the formation of a National Monetary Commission to study the problems and come back with recommendations. This was put under the control of New York's Senator Representative Senator Nelson Aldrich. He held no National Monetary Commissions meetings, and instead he traveled to Europe for 2 years to study how banking was done in Europe, including M.M. Warburg and Company. Under pressure from critics because there was no progress being made, a secret meeting is convened on Jekyll Island off of Georgia on November 22, 1910. That was a privately owned island by J.P. Morgan and others. The key people behind this that were not in attendance at the meeting included J.P. Morgan. His father, Junius Morgan, through his relationship with George Peabody, had become a favorite of the Rothschilds. John D. Rockefeller, who was funded by Kuhn Loeb and Company in part, and Jacob Schiff. Jacob Schiff would donate $20 million in gold bullion, today worth approximately $1.5 billion, to foment the Bolshevik Revolution. In attendance at the meeting was Paul Warburg of the M.M. Warburg and Company in Germany. He had come to the United States in 1902 after the assassination of McKinley. Senator Nelson Aldrich, whose daughter Abby would marry John D. Rockefeller Jr. and give birth to 5 sons, the eldest of which would be named Nelson A. Rockefeller, or Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, the youngest of whom would be David Rockefeller, who would go on to provide the location for the United Nations and fund it through the operations of his bank, Chase Manhattan. Also in attendance was a representative of the Treasury Department, the sub-treasury located in New York City, by the name of Abram Andrew. And 3 additional representatives of New York banks, including Frank Vanderlip, Henry Davison, and Benjamin Strong. Benjamin Strong would go on to become the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and he would have secret meetings with Montague Norman, governor of the Bank of England, in laying down the policies that led to the Great Depression. In 1911, the plan that came out of this meeting was promoted at great expense throughout the United States to gain public favor. They formed what was called the National Citizens League, giving it a good persona, and engaged the services of Professor Laughlin of the University of Chicago and Professor Sprague of Harvard, not unlike cap and trade. The University of Chicago is not a state university. It is a private university founded and funded largely by the Rockefellers. Fighting for the American people were Congressman Charles Lindbergh Sr., father of the famous aviator, and Senator Fighting Bob La Follette. In 1912, President Taft was defeated. He was the popular incumbent Republican president during a period of relative prosperity. His challenges was the wooden, stiff, and relatively unknown former professor, Woodrow Wilson. So how did he win? And the answer is Teddy Roosevelt, who was a Republican, chooses to run against the Republican incumbent as a member of the Independent Bull Moose Party, a party that exists only for this election, and splits the conservative vote. Woodrow Wilson becomes president. His primary qualification for the job appears to be the fact that he was a supporter of J.P. Morgan and argued that people like J.P. Morgan should rule the country. In 1913, we have the equivalent of a revolution that occurs in the United States. On February 3rd, the 16th Amendment of the Constitution is allegedly ratified. This is the amendment that allegedly gives the federal government the power to force upon the American people a federal income tax. On April 8th, the 17th Amendment was ratified. As envisioned by the Founding Fathers, the people would be represented by the House of Representatives, which would have control over the budget and the initiation of all legislation. But the states would be directly represented in making decisions controlling the federal government by their representation in the Senate, and the senators would be designated by the state legislatures. They would, in fact, be ambassadors of the states. By this amendment, the senators would now be elected by popular election. The states were essentially eliminated from the system. And on December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, the Federal Reserve Act was passed at a time where there's a question whether quorum was even present. Because during this period of time, the practice was, in the day of horse and buggy, for representatives to go home for Christmas. Our nation was fundamentally changed. As envisioned by our founding fathers, the people would be at the top, they would be citizens of their sovereign states, and they would pay their taxes in gold and silver coin. Those taxes would be uniform, not progressive, and the states would pass on this interest and debt-free currency to the federal government. By these changes, the Federal Reserve System effectively replaced the states. The Federal Reserve banks are not federal. They are no more federal than Federal Express. They are privately owned corporations. Today, when you write a check to make a payment for your federal income taxes, they do not go to the Treasury Department. You can just look at a canceled check and look at the bank routing number and discover that they go to the Federal Reserve Bank. They are, in fact, collected by the IRS on the benefit of the privately owned Federal Reserve banks to be used as offsets against the debts of the federal government. And then in turn, the Federal Reserve would create money from thin air to loan to the federal government in a process known as debt monetization. The consequence of these changes is quite clear. A group of international banking families have become supreme. They control the parties and the nominations of the president and the federal government, and the people have been removed to the bottom. The Federal Reserve System has the appearance of being federal, with government oversight to make sure that it operates properly, and to be a regional system, not a central bank. This was all the strategy of Paul Warburg, to give it every appearance of being a distributed, decentralized, government-controlled system, servicing the interest of the people. In fact, the Federal Reserve banks are privately owned. They are no more federal than Federal Express. And the key word that you often hear in congressional discussions is the word independent. That is a term where the banks use to mean the government can go take a hike. It is controlled by a group of international banking families who exercise their control and their ownership of the New York banks, which in turn elect the Federal Reserve Bank of New York members, and which in turn controls the operations of the Federal Open Market Committee. These are the operations that fund the federal government. To complete the picture, we have the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, which is a constant communication with New York for instructions, and the remaining 11 regional banks. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York has very unique powers. It controls the open market operations, which finance the U.S. government. This is all handled through 17 primary dealers located in New York. They are the only Federal Reserve Bank to have a permanent seat on the Federal Open Market Committee, and their representative is always the vice chairman. They underwrite all the debts of the government, the agencies, the primary dealers, and now selective companies, and in fact even foreign banks. They receive deposits from all other Federal Reserve banks, which creates a flow from the heartland to New York City. And they thus control our economy, the value of our currency, and our domestic and foreign policies. In 1914, we have a communist uprising in Europe. It is interesting. It calls itself the Spartacus League and issues what's known as the Spartacist Manifesto. This all is, in fact, in honor of Professor Adam Weishaupt of the Illuminati, whose secret name was Spartacus. We see then this connection between the Illuminati, the Freemasons, Karl Marx, the symbols on our dollar bill, and the communist uprising in Europe. In 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution begins the abolition of private property in Russia. Similar thing is going on in the United States. In 1916, the farmers are relatively prosperous, and the Federal Farm Loan Act is passed that encourages the farmers to go into debt in order to expand. And they did. No sooner than they go into debt than the banks tightened, and against the banks and against the farmers only, creating what's called the Agricultural Depression of 1920 to 1921, or the Forgotten Depression. This was done. They stopped lending money to the farms at the time when the crops were due. The farmlands were confiscated, beginning now the abolition of private property in the United States, and the local community banks, which were not incorporated into the Federal Reserve System but continue to compete with it, were closed by the thousands. And Bonnie and Clyde emerged as folk heroes. This is followed in 1929 to 1941 by the Great Depression, which begins on February 6, 1929, and referred to as Black Tuesday. It creates unimaginable hardships. It begins the abolition of private property on homes. Unemployment is 25%, crop prices fell 60%, and what remaining independent banks there were failed by the thousands. But the numbers do not even begin to tell the hardships and the stories and the personal stories. Families were destroyed. Fathers were put into the position of not being able to help their wives or their children or defend them. Mothers were worried about where their children would get their next meal. Hopes and aspirations were dashed and replaced by sheer worry and fraught over their futures. In 1932, Congressman Louis T. McFadden alleged that the Federal Reserve had intentionally created the Depression. And in 2002, Ben Bernanke, in closing his speech in honor of Milton and Anna Friedman, who had concluded the Fed had caused the Depression, agreed. The Depression lasts for more than 20 years before the stock market recovers to its original price. Congressman McFadden was an outspoken defender of the people and a critic of the Federal Reserve. He knew what he was talking about because he was the chairman of the House Banking Committee. And here is parts of one of his speeches to Congress, given in 1932. The Federal Reserve banks are one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever seen. There is not a man within the sound of my voice who does not know that this nation is run by the international bankers. Some people think the Federal Reserve banks are U.S. government institutions. They are not. They are private credit monopolies which prey upon the people of the United States for the benefit of themselves and their foreign and domestic swindlers, and rich and predatory moneylenders. The sack of the United States by the Fed is the greatest crime in history. Every effort has been made by the Fed to conceal its powers, but the truth is the Fed has usurped the government. It controls everything here, and it controls all our foreign relations. It makes and breaks governments at will. The Great Depression resulting from the stock market crash was not accidental. It was a carefully contrived occurrence. The international bankers sought to bring about a condition of despair here so they might emerge as rulers of us all. On October 1st, 1936, while visiting New York City, he was assassinated. This had been the third attempt on his life, and it succeeded. In 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president on March 5th and promptly issued an act declaring our country to be in a state of emergency, and within 30 days passed Executive 6102. By this act, he confiscated all of the gold and the gold certificates held by the people. In other words, by executive decree, he had overruled the Constitution of the United States. And this was done at the threat of huge fines and imprisonment up to 10 years. The gold and the gold certificates were not turned over to the Treasury Department. Instead, they go to the privately owned Federal Reserve banks. The people are forced to accept Federal Reserve notes in exchange for their gold. No sooner than that happens than the next year, gold or paper is devalued by 42%. This is accomplished by changing the price of gold from $20 to $35 an ounce, or in other words, by changing the value of the Federal Reserve note from 1/20th to 1/35th of an ounce of gold. In effect, in a year, the privately owned banking system had confiscated 40% of the wealth of the nation. James Paul Warburg, the son of Paul Warburg, makes the intent clear. Speaking before the United States Senate on February 17, 1950, he has the following to say: "We shall have world government, whether or not we like it. The only question is whether world government will be achieved by conquest or consent." Echoing the concern is J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI, the nation's first FBI director, a position he held for 37 years. His words carry weight. "The individual is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous he cannot believe it exists. The American mind simply has not come to a realization of the evil which has been introduced into our midst. It rejects even the assumption that human creatures could espouse a philosophy which must ultimately destroy all that is good and decent." He is saying basically the American people are too good to understand the evil and thereby become its victims. In 1952, Eustace Mullins first published his book, The Secrets of the Federal Reserve. He was the first to disclose the secret nature by which the Federal Reserve was designed at Jekyll Island. His introduction is written by Ezra Pound, who has been held as a political prisoner by being put in an insane asylum. And he writes, "Here are the simple facts of the great betrayal. Wilson and House knew that they were doing something momentous. One cannot fathom men's motives, and this pair probably believed in what they were up to. What they did not believe in was representative government. They believed in government by an uncontrolled oligarchy whose acts would become apparent only after an interval so long that the electorate would be forever incapable of doing anything efficient to remedy depredations." He is referring to President Woodrow Wilson and his handler, Colonel Edward Mandell House. In 1963, JFK issues Executive Order 11,110, authorizing the Treasury Department to print and issue silver certificates, in other words, legal tender notes, against the silver and silver bullion in the Treasury. He was, in fact, issuing a debt and interest-free currency that would go into circulation without going through the Federal Reserve System. In a period of months, $4.3 billion were issued in $2 and $5 denominations. 5 months later, on November 22nd, he was assassinated, and LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, immediately ended the policy, and the currency was promptly removed from circulation. There is interesting questions about the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and many do not accept the official version. Here is an interesting video taken from that day.
Everything seemed normal as the president's Secret Service bodyguards kept their ever-watchful eyes on the crowd. Everything seemed normal as the president's motorcade began its journey. Everything seemed normal. That is, up until this instant. What took place is so odd that we're going to examine the scene 4 more times. Watch the left side of your screen. The arrow points to Agent in Charge, Emory Roberts, as he stands in the Secret Service follow-up car and motions with his hand. What he is doing is calling away the president's 2 most important bodyguards, the bodyguards whose job was to protect the president's back by riding on the bumper of the limousine throughout the motorcade. Watch again as he stands and orders the agents running at the rear of the president's car away. Watch the confusion inside the follow-up car that results. Now watch the right side of your screen. The arrow points to one of 2 agents whose job was to hop aboard the bumper and act as human shields. He's obviously perplexed. Watch as he shrugs his shoulders 3 times in dismay, each shrug more dramatic than the last. As you watch this scene for the final time, ask yourself, is this the kind of conduct you would expect from an agency that routinely sends an advance team to a city a month or more prior to the president's arrival in order to make preparations? Now ask yourself if the assassination could have taken place at all had those men been on the bumper during the motorcade. This is the rear of the presidential limousine. The back bumper is specially designed with a platform on both the right and left sides. There are also handrails on both sides of the trunk. This is where the agent should have been to provide the president even minimal security. The president, unaware of the treachery behind him and the danger waiting for him ahead, continued on to his death.
During that period of time, the Secret Service did not report to the president or to the White House or even to the administration. The Secret Service, in fact, reported to the Treasury Department, as did the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. In 1971, the gold standard was eliminated entirely by President Richard Nixon. He took us off the gold standard. Up to this point in time, American people were not able to redeem their currency for gold, but foreigners and foreign banks were, and gold was flowing out of the country. I don't believe he was being particularly evil in doing so. All of the momentum and the factors had been put into place prior. Something had to be done to stem the flow. Since that point in time, the dollar has plunged 97%, from 50 cents, 55 cents in the dollar, to 1.83 cents. And the American dream effectively ended. If the Federal Reserve was indeed created to stabilize the value of the currency and the economy, the best thing that could be said about it is it's been an utter failure. In recap, central banking was the Rothschild invention for world control, and it's worked extremely well, and it's done so largely by stealth and ignorance of the public. There have been 5 attempts to put the central bank in place in the United States, and it succeeded in 1913 with the Federal Reserve Act. Our present monetary system All constitutional currencies have been eliminated and replaced by a fiat counterfeit currency controlled by a privately owned monopoly that is issued only in exchange for debt through a process known as debt monetization. The consequences have been that debt has been created, increased, and perpetuated, and that the government of the United States has been in debt every single year since its founding in 1791, with the exception of 2 years during Andrew Jackson's administration. Indeed, there have been deficits every year since 1957. In other words, more than half of the population has never even experienced a surplus. Permanent indebtedness is bondage. A ruling class has been enthroned. It thrives off of debt and the things which create it, such as war. It has every incentive to continue creating, increasing, and perpetuating debt, and it uses its power and wealth to fund the establishment of a new world order and the assault on a sovereign constitutional government. We can see in this simple illustration the factors that I've been discussing. There are a number of things that create the demand for debt, including inflation, which robs us of our true wealth, deficit spending. War in particular has created some 80 to 90% of all federal debt, at least up until approximately 1990. Socialism is probably the second driver. Punitive taxation takes away money from us and forces us into a position of having to borrow. Economic turmoil does the same. And interest on the debt itself is inflationary and creates the need for debt. The debts created, or whether they're taken out by the government or by a corporation or personal, are all ultimately paid for by the people. This whole process of debt monetization and creating debt is made possible by what I refer to as the matrix, a worldwide banking system, nothing like basically a big Quicken program that creates money from thin air by underwriting our debts. The system was created and continues to be controlled by an international banking elite. The people are the victims. We suffer the declining incomes because of the declining value of our currency, the true value of our savings and investments, and our children are born now into substantial amount of indebtedness. The only thing of value in this entire system is the labor of the people, which is used for the benefit to empower and give wealth to the international banking elite, who in turn promote the debt drivers and world government. You can make a difference, and it's important that you do. First, help the truth go viral. When you finish watching this video, click the share button, and you'll come up with the link that you need, that you incorporate in emails, on the message boards, on Facebook and Twitter and so forth, where others can follow that link to find this video. If you're a web designer, click the embed button, and the little bit of script that you need appears, which you can copy and paste in your website so that this YouTube video will appear directly on your website. The remaining features require you to have a YouTube account. If you don't have one, click the Create Account button to create one. Otherwise, go ahead and sign in. Give the video a thumbs up. These scores help others find this video. Add it to your favorites list. Go ahead and subscribe to my channel. You'll be notified of any future issues of further enhancements to this particular series. If you're so inclined, add a comment below the video. These comments, positive comments, are really important to get others to take the time to watch it. And you can also learn more. Click on the Silent No More Pubs. That's the name of my YouTube page. And when you go to that page, you're going to discover a wealth of videos, some of the best videos on the topics of our time. Make sure that you watch part 1 of this series, Why We're in So Much Debt. And this can be done by putting the search term into YouTube and clicking the search button. If you're inclined to be one of those that wants to read, there is no better book to get you started on this topic than Money Defending Your Prosperity. That's available from silentnomorepublications.com. Further suggestions include The Financial Catechism, The Coming Battle, The Secrets of the Federal Reserve, and The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. If you read those 5 books, you will definitely understand virtually every aspect of the monetary system. Make sure that you watch both parts of this series and also watch my video, How to Take Our Country Back. Further suggestions include Freedom to Fascism, which features Aaron Rousseau, Reflections and Warnings, Creature from Jekyll Island featuring G. Edward Griffin, Founding of the Federal Reserve featuring Murray N. Rothbard. All those videos can be found simply by going to my channel, www.youtube.com/user/silent-no-more-pubs, pubs being a simple abbreviation for publications. If you prefer to listen, feel free to listen to my radio interviews with Brian Lee on KYNO, Randall Turner of Money in America, Ernest Hancock of Liberty News Radio, and Dr. Stan Monteith of Radio Liberty, all available from silentnomorepublications.com. I want to thank you for your time, and I encourage you to become active. This is not a spectator sport. Everybody needs to be on the field in order for us to win. If you like, feel free to contact me by dropping me an email at author@silentnomorepublications.com. I hope you have found this video to be helpful to your understanding of the world and getting our prosperity and our liberty back. Thank you.